listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Matt Berkman. Our guest today is MURAD Idris, a political theorist and assistant professor of politics at the University of Virginia. His new book, War for Peace, Genealogies of a Violent Ideal in Western and Islamic Thought, is a critique of the concept of peace as it appears in both ancient and modern political thought. MURAD Idris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
At the beginning of your book, you write, "Peace is not the solution, it is a problem. Why is peace a problem?"
Yeah, that's a great question that gets right to the heart of my book. Peace is a problem in at least a few ways that I wanted to spend a couple of minutes outlining. Peace today is a universal ideal. It's an ideal that everyone is supposed to be committed to, that everyone is supposed to avow their commitment to. And in fact, one of the most common accusations you can say that's leveled against one's enemies, one's opponents, is that they're not committed to peace, that they don't value peace, that they don't love peace. Both internationally and domestically, this ends up producing a structure in which certain groups are compelled to avow this commitment. And I think we can tell that when you have this accusation that some group doesn't love peace or doesn't value peace, that this is a way of indexing that they have been dehumanized, that they are, that their full humanity in some sense is under question. And part of what I'm trying to draw attention to in the book is how this moralization of peace as something that everyone is supposed to desire, that everyone is supposed to love, actually has a much darker side. Part of this darker side is re-entrenching these kinds of asymmetries, these kinds of unevennesses between different populations. Part of it is the way that peace sanitizes different kinds of violence. Part of it is how peace deflects attention away from questions of inequality, questions of injustice, towards questions of how people should be getting along or whether they value peace or don't. And most importantly, peace is a problem because we tend to think about peace as the opposite of war, but both in how it appears in public discourses and how it appears across the history of political thought. And I think that democracies here actually are fundamental to the perpetuation of this discourse. What we often hear invoked is that war is for the sake of peace. The various acts of organized violence are actually for the sake of peace. And when we stop and listen to what is actually something of a paradox here, I think we start to see the status of peace as a moral ideal does more work than we often are willing to acknowledge. War ends up being something that peace legitimates, and peace is supposed to come at the conclusion of a war, but it doesn't. You end up with either interminable wars or with a war following another war. So it's with this general way of questioning why it is that peace is approached as a basic human desire and as a universal ideal that I'm inviting readers and also ordinary people to start to grapple with.
And in your book, you grapple with that by offering us a genealogy of the concept of peace, which you say you do in order to help us move beyond peace. What does that genealogy look like, and how specifically does it help us to get beyond the concept of peace?
So moving beyond peace in the book means moving beyond idealizing peace as a basic ideal that defines what it means to be human and what it means to think about violence. So rather than thinking about peace as the opposite of war, the opposite of violence, I want us to think about the violence that is in peace and the wars that peace justifies. I approach this way of thinking of peace genealogically, by which I mean I approach how peace is moralized, how it turns into a moral ideal, and the discursive structures or the intellectual histories, you could say, the epistemic structures that have come to inform this way of desiring peace. I end up going from Plato to through a series of canonical thinkers, or thinkers that have been really fundamental to the field of political theory, and maybe even the very construction of the humanities. From Plato to Aquinas and a Muslim philosopher, al-Farabi, to Erasmus, who's often called the father of pacifism, oftentimes also called a proto-pacifist. And from Erasmus to Grotius and Gentili, themselves often considered the fathers of international law. And then from them to Hobbes and Ibn Khaldun, a Muslim historian and philosopher. And then finally, in the 6th chapter, to Immanuel Kant and to the Islamist thinker Sayyid Qutb. And part of what I'm trying to do in going through a series of 10 and more thinkers over the course of 2,000 years is to say that we need to think about the idealization of peace that is cooked into our disciplines, into the texts and archives that have come to define what it means to do political theory, what it means to have a Western Civ kind of curriculum. Going through these different texts, I end up making 3 arguments that are part of this genealogy. I identify 3 general structures that peace is embedded within. And part of what the book does then is trace the transformations within them. The first is that peace is a parasitical concept, or that it's embedded in parasitical structures. And by this, I mean that people don't talk about peace on its own. This is the case today, and this really does seem to be a persistent theme. People talk about peace and order, peace and security, peace and law, peace and justice, and so on and so forth. And part of what I'm interested in is what happens when these additions to peace come to be associated so closely with it, when peace, in a sense, on its own appears so insufficient that it needs these other ideas to come along with it. And my argument there is that peace ends up sanitizing these other ideas. They end up doing all sorts of work, all sorts of violent work, but the association with peace ends up rendering this invisible, and that they actually end up providing content to peace, or they end up rewriting the content that peace otherwise would have. The second argument that I make is that peace is a provincial idea. By this I mean we tend to talk about peace as a universal human desire, as I mentioned earlier, but also that we tend to talk about it in its global scope, as though it's supposed to be something that we as a species are moving toward, and that ultimately will encompass us all. But when we look at the actual theorizations of peace from these different thinkers and texts, my argument is that what we actually find are the desires and fears and anxieties that these theorists themselves have built into their writings on peace. And third, I argue that peace is a polemical idea. So rather than understanding peace as the cessation of hostility, I'm interested in how the different discourses of peace arise out of particular antagonisms, how the idealization of peace reflects certain animosities, where, for example, the positive things that peace are associated with sometimes just so happen to be the very things that those who are theorizing it claim that its enemies are lacking or cannot possibly have or cannot possibly value or understand. And part of this polemical structure is how peace then is redeployed against new enemies, against other enemies, as a kind of weapon that is fashioned against some and then honed against others. Part of what I try to do across the book is show how each of these three functions is dynamic, how each of these changes depending on the context that we're looking at in the details. But how the overall structure has been surprisingly persistent, and how that's part of what should get us nervous about how peace continues to be an ideal that remains generally unquestioned.
So the book has 6 substantive chapters, and they're case studies of particular political theorists. Could you choose one that you think is maybe the most illustrative and draw out the basic threads for us so that we can get a sense of what you're doing?
Sure. Let me go with the first chapter, because I think that's where a lot of the pieces really are laid out. I think it also might be the longest of the chapters in the book. So this is the chapter on Plato, on Plato's Laws. Plato's Laws illustrates these 3 points in the following way. So in Book 1 of the Laws, you have the Athenian stranger, who is you could say the main character. He's walking with these 2 other old men. One is Cleinias the Cretan, and the other is Megillus the Spartan. And it's interesting to start with Plato, I think, in large part because Plato, of course, is at the often placed at the center of our curricula within political theory, and also is often talked about as the Athenian philosopher. And Athens, of course, ends up representing for us a certain a belief in a certain kind of democratic inheritance, one that problematically writes out the Muslim reception of the Greeks, but that's a story for another time. To go back to the laws, you have these 3 characters, these 3 interlocutors walking. And eventually they start talking about the origin of their constitutions from their respective cities. And the Cretan, Cleinias, ends up making the claim that all of the laws that his city has are with a view toward war rather than peace. And he ends up then saying there's no such thing as peace. It's simply a name that people give to something that is a fiction, something that is a falsehood. There is only a kind of perpetual war. In this chapter, I give a close reading of the speeches that Cleinias gives. And let me just illustrate some of the key moves, because I think that they telegraph the argument most clearly. First, to get to the provincial structure. You have Cleinias saying that there is a war of all cities against all cities, but you also then have him restating his position and saying you have a war of all persons against all cities. And I'm interested in how, when we talk about war, when we talk about peace within these discourses, there are assumptions about who the primary agents and the primary objects of war and peace are going to be, who they are. Notice how in this case we have a shift from the city-state, from the Greek polis, to the person who perhaps probably belongs to a polis. What do we do about those who do not live in a polis? Are they outside of the framework of war and peace? What do you do about the fact that Athens became an empire? What do you do about the fact that the Persian Empire was not organized as a series of city-states, but in fact represented the most bureaucratically advanced and militarily intimidating power at the time? So you have a schematization of war and peace that conveniently, perhaps, writes out the Persian entirely, erases the Persian Empire from that view. And that, for part of my argument there, those kinds of erasures and those kinds of insistences on who counts as the proper subject of peace and the proper candidate for peace, these carry anxieties, and they reflect fears and desires that have to do with these kinds of geopolitical questions and these questions of identity. When we turn to the Persian Empire and its relationship to these discourses of peace, I think we also then see that the values that the Athenian stranger, Megillus, and Cleinias are associating with peace are ones that the Persian barbarian, as the Persians were often called by the Athenians, were excluded from. So the very idealization of peace that we eventually get to in Plato's Laws is written, you could say, at the expense of or by putting the Persian at the margins of that discourse. And thirdly, as the three interlocutors continue to chat about the relationship of different practices to war, to the aims of a city and constitutions and things of the sort, the Athenian stranger says, okay, tell you what, you say that there's no such thing as peace. Let's just switch the conversation for a second. Imagine that there are brothers, and these brothers, some of them are just and some are unjust. And now let's imagine that there are three possible judges. One judge kills the unjust brothers and has the just ones live happily. The other has the just brothers rule over the unjust brothers. And the third judge reconciles these brothers to one another. You would think that Cleinias and Megillus, who had just been insisting that war is a perpetual feature of life, that they would choose one of the first two options. And instead, they, finding perhaps the fraternity is as an important value, they end up choosing for reconciliation. So somehow they go from championing perpetual war, or at least saying that we need to acknowledge its existence, to wanting quarreling brothers to be reconciled with one another. And in addition to drawing out for us how the earlier schematization of polis against polis, or person against polis, had very politely elided the household and what goes on in the household, this actually ends up being the way that the three interlocutors finally agree that what we need isn't peace, but rather peace and friendship. What we need is peace where citizens are almost like brothers to one another. And that's the moment that crystallizes a lot of the arguments of the book. Rather than peace on its own, we have peace and friendship. This understanding of peace and friendship is one that operates as a kind of hinge, I say at one point in the book, as a kind of shift from the opposition between war and peace to something more blurry, because friendship also refers to the military bond that these citizens have with one another as they go to war with others. So in this sense, the opposition between war and peace is mediated, you could say, by the terms that are added to peace. Security does something very similar with respect to the relationship between peace and war. And let me add this one final point about how friendship operates here, because the addition of friendship to peace in this text is one that's at the expense of the Persian, where the Persian subject in Greek discourses was one who is often understood as being incapable of understanding the importance of friendship or of participating in it, because ostensibly the Persian did not recognize the centrality of equality for everyday life and for friendship. And all of these different discourses are ones that have real resonances with how democracies today tend to think about peace and the way that it legitimates violence. But I'll stop there for now.
So you're looking at the way that philosophers and maybe states are invoking the idea of peace, but what about the way that peace is used by people from below, like the activists who say no justice, no peace, or when Martin Luther King says that we want a peace that is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice? How does that square with your analysis, and what alternatives to the dominant discourse of peace are you looking at?
Thanks. No, that's a good question. So the book is focused on, you could say, the history of philosophical discourses surrounding peace. And yes, the book does not look at, say, the alternatives that ordinary, or let's say everyday protesters have. It doesn't look at the way that Black Lives Matter activists have deployed the language of peace, or the way the Palestinian protesters have, or the way that Ambedkar or Martin Luther King or others have. Part of what I'm interested in doing in the book is troubling the easy way with which that distinction is often drawn. One in which we have a bad notion of peace that comes from either the way that states end up talking about peace, or the way the different philosophers have talked about it, and then oftentimes kind of a way that's sometimes constructed as pure, or as purely ethical, or something of the sort. Part of what I want us to push against is the overall structure that has turned peace into something that those who are in fact being marginalized, those against whom there are these histories and ongoing realities of violence, that they need, when they protest, to do so in the name of peace rather than in the name of something else on its own, rather than in the name of justice. So the idea, no justice, no peace, I think does something a little different from wars for the sake of peace, and also something different from the demand that people, if they're going to protest, to do so peacefully. I think that is importantly different. It does have a critical edge, and it is a critical edge that I think is very much in keeping with what the book is trying to draw attention to. which is the invisible kinds of violence that peace ends up sanitizing. But nonetheless, I want us to question why it is that peace continues to occupy that status, so that it's something that people find that they have to continue to avow themselves to, in a way that maintains its status as a moral ideal rather than, and this is one of the primary moves that the book is making in trying to think about alternative conceptualizations, rather than going from a moral ideal into a political idea. And what I mean by this is understanding peace not as a universal desire, but as a historical concept whose idealization reflects some histories, some animosities, some inequalities. Part of what I try to do in the book is gesture towards different alternatives or different ways of thinking about peace, not as a moral ideal, not as an answer, not as a solution, but precisely as a political idea. And I'll just briefly sketch the 2.5 or 3 pages where I suggest this in the epilogue. These are alternative ways of thinking about peace that I find in the genealogies themselves. They're often ways of thinking about peace that Plato or Erasmus or Immanuel Kant end up saying are problematic, are not sufficient, are different ways of thinking about peace that they end up dismissing or excluding partially, if not entirely. The first of these is the truce. So the way that peace is constructed in contemporary discourses and also in political philosophy, it's supposed to be this perpetual and universal idea. But this temporality, this desire for absolute mastery is one that is not only untenable, but one that ends up justifying all forms, all sorts of inequality and violence as we attempt to get towards this thing that we are told is actually the telos of mankind, and that the primary vehicle for it is the state. The state, which, as we all know, has been a vehicle for multiple forms of violence and dispossession. So against this understanding of peace, I say, let's look at the truce, an idea of peace that is finite, an idea of peace that it would be difficult to ask so much of, and an idea of peace that it would be really difficult to treat as a moral ideal. If we think about every peace as always already a truce, then that, I think, can help us scale back some of the moralization. The second way that I try to come up with an alternative way of talking about peace is talking about peace in the definite. So rather than talking about peace as a kind of free-floating moral and normative idea, talking about peace more concretely in terms of this peace or that peace, the peace between this state or this social group and that other social group who it might happen to be oppressing or systematically oppressing. So by learning to talk about peace in these more concrete terms, by training ourselves to do that, my invitation or challenge even is to refer to the concrete relations rather than these abstract ideals. And then thirdly, talking about peace not in terms of people coming together and speaking in unison or saying the same things, but rather understanding that peace can also take the form of separation. It can take the form of being apart from others. And again, here I think it's important for me to say that I do not refer to these other ways of talking about peace as ideals, or to substitute sort of one understanding of universalizing moralization with another, but rather to understand that when we think about peace as separation, we are both thinking about the additional kinds of possibilities where it doesn't always have to be about intervention in the name of saving some, but also where we can think about the real violence that comes both with peace understood as people coming together and needing to agree, and also forms of peace that are about separation that have to do, for example, with separating communities from one another in terms of whether it's apartheid or separation barriers and walls or other incredibly violent modalities of peace.
So, this is a podcast about democracy. And so, I got to ask, what is the relationship in your mind between peace and democracy?
Democracies are those states, regimes, let's say, that have been among the most staunch rhetorically or discursively champions of peace, right? Where from Immanuel Kant, we get the idea of a democratic peace, where if all states would be democracies, we would finally, hopefully, move toward some kind of perpetual and universal peace with citizens that desire the right things. At the same time, democracies have been at the forefront of innovating new forms of violence and coming up with some of the most novel justifications for war. Oftentimes, some of the most perverse justifications and practices of war and violence. So in that sense, I think that the idealization of peace by democracies and for democracies helps us see the deep paradoxes that democracies have been at the very center of in the last couple of centuries. And part of what I try to do in the book is highlight the ways that peace has provided cover for violence has also been one of the ways that it has provided cover for empires that call themselves democracies and in fact call themselves states, but in fact operate very differently, both domestically vis-a-vis certain minoritized populations, and also internationally and transnationally vis-a-vis those groups and enemies that democracies cast as the enemies of humanity, the enemies of peace, and the enemies of democracy itself.
So, as you know, we're currently in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, which has been framed by the government as a kind of war against the virus. So I'm wondering if your work on war and peace has anything to tell us about the response to this coronavirus crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question that really is about the crisis that we are currently in. I don't talk about the crisis in the book itself, but I think that you're exactly right. The way that the response to the virus has been framed as a war, that should get us to think a little more deeply and a little more carefully about the relationship between war and peace. Part of this has to do with saying, so it's framed as a war. What is the opposite of this war? When does this war end? Is the opposite of this war peace? Is it the elimination of the virus? And why is it that we are moving towards talking about war in these metaphorical ways? Why is it that at the same time as we have moved towards talking about war in metaphorical ways, a war on coronavirus, a war on drugs, and all these other kinds of wars that democracies and the U.S. in particular have been in the habit of naming, why is it that at the same time as this is happening, the foreign political and military practices no longer seem to be getting the designation of war? They are various operations and different kinds of missions. So how is it that precisely as war becomes much more of a metaphor, the different wars that are being waged seem to be getting a different kind of vocabulary, a different kind of language, where neither of these different kinds of violence end up having peace as an end, even as it's constantly touted as a kind of ideal. So I would want us to think a little more carefully and a little more skeptically at precisely these kinds of framings, and instead maybe to say, when we think about the war, are there other wars raging on within society that are less metaphorical? Are there other possibilities for people coming together that exceed the image and the vocabulary of peace? That, in a sense, is what it means to go beyond peace.
Murad Idris, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.